Do you want me to get started? All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Ross Burshaw. I'm the Executive Director of Flinders Foundation. Welcome to the afternoon session. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the land of the Kaurna people, pay respects to Elders past, present and emerging, and extend that to any First Nations people here today or watching online. I've got a very special guest to present the session today. It's Nigel Harris. Before I introduce Nigel, from our perspective at Flinders Foundation, what do we want you to take away from today's session? One is to have a shared understanding about the power of gratitude and how that can transform healthcare and medical research, but also to think about how you can build a relationship with Flinders Foundation, how we can develop that into a meaningful partnership that really changes health outcomes for the community. So Nigel recently awarded an AM on a long list of achievements in his career, but he's now the Managing Director of Nigel Harris and Associates. In a 40-year career, he's held several executive leadership roles in not-for-profit organisations, most notably as the Chief Executive Officer of Mater Foundation in Queensland for 24 years. He holds an MBA as well as qualifications in public relations and marketing, and he's currently the Deputy Chair of Act for Kids, a Director of Leukemia Foundation Australia, and he also serves on the board of the Institute for Sustainable Philanthropy. A long list. So for those who haven't met me or worked with Flinders Foundation, we're here to support your work. We are in awe of your work, and that's across medical research and also the care and experience that people have should they need to come to hospital. But it's only made possible by people who are really grateful and want to give back. So we really depend on our community to support your work, and we want to do that in partnership with you. But for most supporters, giving is something that's much deeper. It's something that comes from the heart. It's due to a connection they have or some experiences they've lived through, and the gratitude that they wish to express. And that's what Nigel's here to talk us through today. So welcome, Nigel.
Thanks very much, Ross, and look, thanks for having me. It's a bit cliched, almost corny to say it's good to be back, but I'm an Adelaide boy. I left here 28 years ago, and this is still very much the place that formed me. And in fact, this area, I spent most of my time growing up, and certainly before my wife and I and our then young children left Adelaide, we only lived really back over the hill and a little bit there. So I know this area, and I know Flinders as well, for a whole lot of reasons, good and bad, including my father-in-law passing away here some 8 years ago. So like many of you, there are connections, and I guess for me it's one of those things that I always hold very dear in coming back home. Today I'm going to touch on or talk about the idea of gratitude and transforming healthcare and medical research. And I guess it straight away leads in this notion of the esoteric and the intangible moving into something that's practical and tangible, and how do these two different elements actually attend to each other. And one of the challenges we have, particularly in the area of philanthropy, is what are those components that we can actually see and touch and feel and sense and cling onto and make something meaningful out of all of that. So that's really the essence of today, and talking about what I believe are the transformational powers of the way in which we engage with people, particularly in and around gratitude. And when we talk about gratitude, let's just think about what we mean and what we're actually addressing in this conversation. Firstly, thinking about the word that derives from the Latin gratia, grace, graciousness, gratefulness, and for me that takes us to the sense of how we engage as people, what we give and what we get back, and what that human exchange and interaction might be. There's a great body of evidence in the field of social science that identifies that gratitude has measurable benefits for just about every area of our lives. The work of Misty Pratt in The Science of Gratitude talks to this. And again, touches on this idea that gratitude can be described as a social glue born of anger. And I just see it as a real counterpoint to the way in which we as a society, are continuing to be polarized and prone to anger, where gratitude becomes a very significant counterpoint and panacea to our movement to be angry. And I can understand so much, particularly in the last couple of years, and particularly in environments like this, where there's been inordinate and unprecedented pressure around the experiences we have in work and in life broadly. But Shane poses a very interesting and challenging question. And it brings us to the question of, so why is gratitude important in the human experience? And again, if we look to some of the studies that have been done in this area that show that we inordinately as humans pay more attention to to headwinds than tailwinds. So that is to say that the things that get in our way and challenge us and create negative experiences, as opposed to things that sit behind us and propel us into positive experiences. The studies show that when we actually pay more attention to the tailwinds, it accentuates feelings of happiness and optimism and positive emotion. And gratitude, or practicing gratitude, magnifies those positive feelings more than it reduces negative feelings, according to Emmons. And this is important as well. This is not about masking negativity or trying to push that away, because I think they are very real in the experience we have, but how we actually promote positivity and actually increase what's good around us. I think the other area I'll identify, and this sort of moves into the work of Daniel Goleman and emotional intelligence, is gratitude is associated with emotional maturity. So the way in which we are as people, and we continue to accentuate our self-awareness and our connection with others, is part of that notion of gratitude as well. A logical question to consider is, where does gratitude fit into healthcare? I think there are a couple of dimensions. Research again tells us that, or shown that grateful people are healthier. Now, again, I'm no expert in this domain, but that seems to make sense from where I look at it as a non-healthcare practitioner. It helps us to see a bigger picture and become more resilient in the face of adversity. And again, thinking about our experience in the last couple of years, this is perhaps even more present in terms of what might sustain us and guide us. Gratitude unshackles us from toxic emotions and has lasting effects on the brain. So here we're moving into some science that I also see touching the area of philanthropy as well, and giving, where we actually see positive reinforcement in what's happening around our emotions and our neuro responses as well. And research-based strategies also talk to building a culture of gratitude in organisations, and I was particularly taken with some work that looked at gratitude practice for nurses, and again bringing this back to a healthcare context. So thinking again about how gratitude might be positively leveraged to serve purpose and people. Fundamentally, if we think about gratitude making us more giving and decreasing self-centeredness. Now, once again, that sounds like a pretty basic sort of sense of where that might take us, but there's a challenge in that and how we actually think and act upon that sense of where gratitude might shift us from and to. Critically, the benefits of gratitude take time. So again, as is true in investing relationships in more completely, gratitude is something that materializes over time and takes time to invest in. And so it's very much germane to that human experience. And Nicole Linke talks about gratitude as a superpower. And whilst again that may be a way of looking at something in a primarily superficial sense, I think when we think about what that actually means and what Linke's actually saying here, is it actually gives us access and capacity to exercise connection with people, do things that actually benefit us as community, as institutions, as society, and each other. That's actually well within our grasp. And of those superpowers, it's one that we actually have inordinate control over. As I was thinking about this session, I couldn't help but notice, but in fact last Wednesday was World Gratitude Day, the 21st of September. So again, through United Nations, we're called upon to think about and celebrate this idea of gratitude. Now, there are all sorts of days for us to mark, but it's probably an interesting bookmark to think that we're having this conversation just a few days after World Gratitude Day. But the fact that it's a conversation at that level also says something to me, that it's a conversation we perhaps need to think about more completely and lean into, about where that really, what it means to us and where it takes us. So that's really what I want to do with you this afternoon. I want to touch on a few elements of gratitude, looking at experiencing gratitude, power, giving and receiving, and how it connects us. But if I firstly think about our experience with gratitude, and I move to think about the way in which we engage in it. So the idea of actually extending gratitude, consciously, deliberately acknowledging someone for something they have done that in some way has moved, benefited us, been relevant to us. This deliberate act that we take to stop, pause, think and say thank you. Thank you for what you've done. Thank you for your assistance. Thank you for the way in which your actions have impacted positively on my experience. It's a pretty simple thing to do, but the question here is how often do we actually do that? How often do we actually pause in our busyness in the way in which we engage life to actually stop and take time to extend gratitude and thank? And then how often do we think about the impact that has on the people who we acknowledge, what it actually means to them, how they experience that extension of gratitude, how that shapes their reaction and response, and what that does to actually forge a bond between you and that person as well. We can gloss over that in a fairly light way, but I'm going to suggest there's much more in that, and there's a challenge that is easily and simply accessed, but we don't always move to that place. Similarly, thinking about how we receive gratitude, I think, is another really important challenge. Someone takes the time to acknowledge the effort that you've made, the work you've done, the contribution you've made, the impact on their lives. We go, oh, it was nothing. No, it's just what I do. This is perhaps particularly true in healthcare, where we might have a sense of almost perhaps being slightly diminished by the fact that I should celebrate or acknowledge or respond to the fact that I've actually impacted on someone's life. But think of what that means to the person that's extending that gratitude. Their considered, deliberate approach to say thank you, to acknowledge the impact on their lives, probably took something on their part, an effort to actually say thank you. We brush it aside, we actually diminish that experience, we diminish their experience, as well as not give ourselves the opportunity to step into that experience of receiving gratitude as well. So we take a moment to reframe that and pause and think about how do we accept the gratitude? What does that actually take for us to stop, reflect and go, look, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to say that to me. It means a lot. I appreciate your acknowledgement. And where does that even then take us in both receiving the gratitude but articulating that as well? They are really simple things to do, but how often do we actually attend to those questions? I think there's a real challenge in there. Taking it to a healthcare context, I have a long-term colleague I worked with at Mater who, before she joined Mater Foundation, had many, many decades in nursing. And Jackie would tell the story of the nurse who would, when asked by a patient, or in fact a patient would say, "Nurse, you've been so good to me, you've cared for me, what can I do to repay you?" The nurse would take the patient's hand and say, "Just getting better is all you need to do." Jackie would tell that story about the shift that she was experiencing in working in philanthropy and what that actually stopped in the way that the patient might express gratitude and where that might take them. And one day Jackie actually said to me, "You know that story I continue to tell about the nurse and the patient?" She said, "That was me. I was that nurse. I was the person who actually said, just getting better is fine." And I've come to learn that in philanthropy, what I was doing was actually stopping that person express their gratitude, stopping a way to say thank you in something that meant something to them. And in fact, rather than actually just deflecting the gratitude, I was taking away their power of acknowledgement and what they actually may be able to do that was meaningful to them. Because certainly in that situation, there was a power imbalance. There was a relative powerlessness from a patient perspective and a power that was held from the healthcare professional. So I think this reflection is something that's quite profound. And we are then challenged to think about what our experience is when we extend gratitude to people and what it actually takes for us to do that, and what our experience is when you receive gratitude and how we actually articulate and what that means to others as well as what that means to us. Now, cynics might dismiss that as platitudes. It's just nice sugar coating on the human experience. But again, I come back to Shane Rogers' article about what's making us so angry, and I think perhaps we may warrant some benefit from actually just reflecting on the cynical response, that knee-jerk reaction to dismiss these things out of hand, rather than reflecting on the human experience. And equally so, when we think about the experience, clearly it needs to be authentic. Platitudes and superficial acknowledgement of gratitude and giving and receiving will be seen for what it is. I mean, we all can see the sycophantic and the insincere construction of these exchanges. But equally, I argue that authenticity is completely transparent. When people are being authentic about their expressions of gratitude, giving and receiving, it's plain to see, and it shifts us in different ways as humans. And we think about how you feel and what that does for yourself and others and the impact we make. And again, often unseen and unspoken in that sense as well. So critically here, it's about how we enjoy the experience of gratitude. And then if we think about power, and I think this is an important conversation that once again can often be swept under the carpet somewhat on the question of human experience, how we leverage and lessen the power of gratitude both knowingly and unknowingly, and how we can leverage the connection and the possibilities of the human experience by both giving and receiving gratitude in a way that is authentic, is genuine, is connecting, but simply also what we do when we don't engage in that context, when we diminish that experience and we fundamentally stop a raft of possibilities that can accrue next, and particularly when we start to think about what gratitude, which in itself is a gift, is given and received, also starts to extend to the way we think about the giving of other gifts and the giving of gifts that begin to have a tangible and very demonstrable impact on institutions, communities and people. So thinking about these power dimensions and how we play a role in them in a positive and negative fashion, knowingly and unknowingly, and what this means for our experience and how taking that experience in terms of conscious action repositions the way in which we engage with each other as people. So thinking about the giving of gratitude and what we actually are challenged to think about and act on then, the question of being generous and gracious and expecting gratitude, and we come back to this definition of the word graciousness, and why we do or we don't do it. And I think it's worth calling out a few of the challenges. Is it pride? Is there a sense of pride that we feel in some way that we might be diminishing ourselves by acknowledging the work and the contribution of others? Does that really lessen our own perspective, or is that an artificial barrier? Is it an awkwardness? Now look, let's be realistic. The human experience fundamentally is awkward, isn't it? The relationships we have in awkward fashion can be awkward and difficult. And I think we'd be pretending to consider otherwise, whether it's at work or at home or in life more broadly. We're all creatures of human frailties and fragilities, as well as being spectacular in our abundance as well. So is that a fact? Is it a comfort thing? And we can be comfort and a bit shy and diffident sometimes about these terms, even in the expression of what we give to each other. Or is there a sense of diminishment? Am I somehow diminishing myself by exercising grace and gratitude to you? Am I lessening myself in any way? I think the argument very clearly is there the opposite would be true. And thinking about, are we being authentic? Once again, I've already touched on this, to this notion of the difference between an authentically and real expression and receipt of gratitude and that which is not. And then the question of who is it about? Is it about me and making me better, or is there a greater experience and power in what I project to you as I extend my gratitude to you and how I receive gratitude to you as well? So is there something that's actually serving of others and fundamental about the way we serve each other rather than being self-serving? It also brings us to this notion of how we receive gratitude and this positive power in the humility and acceptance of the gifts that are given, the way in which we actually stop and reflect. As I touched on earlier, this notion to deflect and actually exercise what is not inauthentic or lacking any humility in just deflecting a compliment or expression of gratitude, but to get past that and then to think about how we actually genuinely and authentically engage with people who are seeking to do something to serve us in expressing that gratitude as well, and thinking again what it does for others as well as you in that communion. And lastly, this brings us to this question of how gratitude connects us as people, and I contend that it would actually open us up to each other more completely in a human and authentically human sense of the way in which we interact with each other. Again, all of this is simple, the way in which it shapes the way we relate to each other and the experience we have. But if it were simple and if it was something we would be doing every day, why would we then be having a discussion about gratitude? Why wouldn't it be self-evident and present in all of our experiences? Why would there in fact be a World Gratitude Day? Why would there be something that needs to remind us to pay a little different level of attention to this particular question? So then I want to turn to this question of philanthropy, or the word philanthropy, which again is a term that can be distorted and misunderstood, I'd contend, in terms of how we think about that. And fundamentally, it really talks to the communion between people. In fact, the word itself, philanthropy, philos and anthropos, love of people. And in that context, when we talk about love, and we talk about the love of people, we're talking about the different types of love. So again, bringing it back to its Greek etymology, this idea of there are 8 different types of love and the way in which we fundamentally relate to each other. So we get a bit lost sometimes and we think about this attends to romantic love. That's not really what we're talking about in this context. It actually just talks to the way we are as people and shapes this sense of the way in which we connect as well. However, when we think about the question of love and people, we get a bit lost in this question of what we think philanthropy means. And we've somehow moved to a place where the word has been conflated and even contorted to mean anything almost other than love and people, which is its fundamental origin. We think about money, we think about wealth, we think about power, we think about influence, we think about largesse, and we think about things that are bad as well as good. Now, again, relationships between people can be both bad and good and everything in between, but it's not really where we should be directing our focus in philanthropy. A colleague of mine, Beth Breeze, who's a professor of fundraising at the University of Kent, wrote a book this year titled In Defence of Philanthropy. Beth was moved to write this book to really bring back a conversation that addressed the fundamental tenets of philanthropy and shifted the premise from it being seen to be something that was bad. In her research, she identified there was a very strong default to a lot of negative perceptions and emotions around philanthropy, and that was just a fundamental misapplication of what this word meant. So I think that we are challenged to step back and reapply a notion of what the word philanthropy means and to get back to its origins rather than just assume a set of meanings that are not just wrong, but they stop us from actually engaging the human experience. And this sort of talks to how philanthropy as an idea challenges us as well. And here we're talking about the discomfort and sometimes distorted focus that can accrue when we think about philanthropy, particularly if we go down the path of giving and money and asking for money and raising money, and then we move into some themes that begin to address a level of discomfort, and they take away not just our understanding, but more critically, the opportunity that's created when we fundamentally come back to this idea of philanthropy about being love of people and how we serve that love of people, that relationship between us as well. And so here we come to this question of connecting gratitude and philanthropy together and what that actually means for us. And I would contend that it opens the door to the actions, gratitude I should say, opens the door to the actions that serve philanthropy. That is to say that if we're looking to engage people in the way they express love, pursue relationships, gratitude is a starting point and a proposition that opens up those conversations around what I might be moved to do. And Hugh Mackay talks about this in his book, What Makes Us Tick, when he talks about the 10 things that actually we fundamentally operate under as people. And in his closing remarks, he identifies this notion of deep down, we're all good guys. We're prone to philanthropy. We're prone to do good. And notwithstanding what the cynics may actually say about motivation, we're fundamentally wired to actually respond to each other and connect in those relationships between people. That's kind of how we're wired as people. And part of that is this question of the way in which we give thanks and share love to serve people, and that is to share the relationships that actually ending up serving each other. And then when we frame this other word that is also prone to a lot of distortion and confusing, a word that we use in our sector, fundraising, we can start to challenge what that process around serving philanthropy might be. The definition that I prefer to use for fundraising from Hank Rosso is it's a servant of philanthropy. It's an agency, a mechanism that actually serves the process of philanthropy. It's not the servant, it is a servant, along with giving time, giving voice or advocacy, association, and other forms of giving. Fundraising is one of those elements. But it's a very, very powerful tool because it puts the means under which things can be accomplished. The funding that drives transformation in healthcare, pursues research over the long term that it takes to actually identify and pursue discoveries, and has many other social benefits as well. And if we think about this notion of fundraising, serving philanthropy, we begin to see how gratitude opens the way in which we actually can release the opportunity to turn that to a tangible and practical benefit. So the question then is, what does this mean for how we think about linking gratitude and philanthropy? Suggests that it paves the way for giving in a positive and focused context. If you're actually building relationships based on an exchange that's based on positive experience, on those tailwinds, if you will, that we touch on, then we are actually talking about a relationship that can move from the expression of connection in a positive formation to one that opens the door to how we might give to each other and what that giving might be and how that might advance shared community and social benefit. It engages people in serving purpose. And once again, if you go back to the words of Hugh Mackay, you look at this idea that we're fundamentally wired to help each other, to do good, then how does that actually translate in a practical and tangible way of serving purpose? The Dutch researchers Beckers and Wiepking did some work back in 2007, a metadata analysis, where they identified that 85% of gifts given in their metadata analysis were given because of an ask. That is to say that if we took the premise, which is often prosecuted, that, well, we don't need to do any fundraising, people will just give anyway, according to Beckers and Wiepking, we'll settle for about 15% of what might be given. It's fine, but it doesn't do a lot to advance social purpose. It doesn't do a lot to advance the causes that we're working for human benefit. So really what's inside of that is this notion that as much as we are wired to do good, something has to happen to move us from good intent to the action that takes us into something meaningful. And that's the critical question that really sits in front of all of us there. I mean, really a challenge for all of you to think about who this morning sprung out of bed and said, who will I give to today? No one. That's a surprise. Should at least be 15% of you, according to Beckers and Wiepking. But that's not to say that there's not that intent. That's not to say that you don't do what you do in your lives to pursue things that are important to you and engage in very meaningful and positive and productive engagement. But it takes something to shift that into an actual action. Again, we think about what it means in looking at the way it identifies and responds to aspiration and intent. What people aspire to do and what they intend to do can sometimes be different. So how do we actually guide that aspiration into focused intent? And how it attends to those who give and those who benefit. So here we're talking about the idea of those who might give support, donors and supporters, and those who benefit. And in a healthcare context, we're talking about patients and families of patients. The real challenge here is they're often the same people. The notion of beneficiaries and donors being the same people, particularly in healthcare, is very present. So how we think about that construct as well is an important question in thinking about meaning. And it also challenges where the intermediary, if you will, the institution that facilitates the work that's done to advance healthcare and medical research fits in that process as well. And I'm going to contend here that there is a really important fulfillment role in enabling the work that is fed by aspiration and intent from those who give, that supports those who benefit immediately and well into the future, is the domain of the institution, but it's not, as sometimes we are prone to do, the most important part of that communion. I'd suggest that for many, the institution is actually seen less than we would like it to be. understood less than we would want it to be, and becomes a more silent or secondary partner in that process of how benefit is realised. So I think there's a challenge in there in how we see ourselves within institutions as well. Pardon me, not always a popular conversation within institutions, but nonetheless one that I think is worthy of some attention and focus as well. And all this challenges us to reframe our focus when we consider the questions of gratitude and philanthropy, and in that context thinking about what we focus on. And here, I jumped ahead a little bit too enthusiastically. And here actually we want to be talking about the questions of purpose as well as people. So if I touch on possibility. So the question here I'm really prosecuting is this notion of thinking about how people's desire to serve purpose also moves to possibility, which then in turn takes us to this question of transformational and sustainable giving. So here there is an important departure in the context of thinking about what sort of giving serves us well. It moves us on from a mode of transactional giving, which I would still contend to be the dominant form of giving experience, particularly in fundraising practice and philanthropy, and takes us to a different proposition entirely. And it's not that transactional giving is a bad thing. I'm not to suggest that's a bad experience at all, but if that's the only level of giving that's ever realised, then the full extent of possibility and potential in what giving might otherwise accomplish remains unrealised. And I think that we don't always test this question, and there are a number of reasons why we may not do so. So to talk about the notion of what's transformational in a healthcare context is what shifts something from a current state to a future state. And research is a very, very good example in my experience of having been part of an organisation that put significant funding to medical research over long periods of time. Identified that the traditional or the contemporary funding sources for medical research, peer-reviewed grants, NHMRC and other sources, created certain limitations around longitudinal funding and were increasingly difficult to attract in an increasingly competitive environment. So the ability to augment research with philanthropy and particularly philanthropy that enabled transformational research endeavours to be undertaken was particularly important. And coupling this with a sustainable context as well. That is to say that there was funding year on year on year on year. Now, I don't need to tell any of you engaged in medical research how challenging short-term funding is, particularly against this longer-term funding proposition. The experience that really stands out for me is over many years in my time at Mater, funding research in prostate cancer and realising that there were any number of times in that early work that was being done where peer review funding literally dried up, that research would have stopped. And the one thing that kept it going was funding, sustainable funding through philanthropy, which ultimately led to transformational outcomes that were not just evidenced through peer review papers, but findings that continue to inform and advance other research as well in that particular area of work. So that very much is that lived experience in both being transformational and funding. And when we think about the transformational and sustainable funding question, we're looking about the question of what can be accomplished by pursuing significant change over long term in both capability and capacity. And that is critical to the big ideas that really are those things that shift the experience in healthcare and medical research, and perhaps those questions that we are less prone to examine and really prosecute intensely in these environments for want of the immediate transactional type of funding needs and the short-term responses that we are quite reasonably drawn to as well. So in all of this, there's nothing new to really raise here, but just reminding us of the focus that opening up these different view, particularly against a backdrop of tightening funding in both healthcare and medical research, that a different way of looking at philanthropy, a different way of accessing that through thinking about gratitude opens up this question of both transformation and sustainability in giving. And it takes us to a different lens when we think about fundraising as well, where we've considered the questions of gratitude and philanthropy and thinking about purpose and thinking about transforming and sustaining funding rather than singular funding. We begin to look at this different perspective in the context of what we mean and what can be created by fundraising. One of the tropes that I find challenging in terms of fundraising is the focus on the money. Now, the name would suggest that, but I would suggest that fundraising is not about money, it's about what the money does, what it enables. And if we shift that premise just ever so slightly, we begin to see and experience a different focus on purpose and on outcomes, on impact. And we also see one where the experience and the aspiration leads us into a different set of potentials as well. So, having considered the questions of gratitude and philanthropy and purpose and transformation and sustainable funding, we move into this question of challenging barriers as well, and what is it that actually begins to take us away from the idea of awkwardness, discomfort, disdain, and those other factors that get in the way of how we practice gratitude, how we practice philanthropy, and even thinking about fundraising. An example of that might be, if we think about fundraising as simply asking for money without context, then it doesn't really have a particular path or destination. It's a pointless exercise. So there has to be something that sits around that. So the question then is to come back to, sorry, jumping into it, is the so what if. So what if we can change the fundamental misunderstanding and reluctance around fundraising practice born of a different understanding and connection of philanthropy, which is fueled by the way in which we actually engage with gratitude, engage through gratitude. What if we can change the power in fundraising relationships to become an equal exchange in giving and receiving, again born of the way in which we understand philanthropy, of love of people, and the way in which we exercise gratitude in what we give and receive. And if we enable people to play a role in fundraising through giving and receiving, through the way in which we understand and practice gratitude and philanthropy, what might be possible then in serving human purpose? And we think about how this creates a different set of possibilities and outcomes when we translate it to the application of healthcare and medical research over time, and how that can begin to shift not just the small gifts, but the big gifts that can actually shift experience. And all of this shifts the focus from money to people and to purpose. And when we think about what that actually means, I think the best expression of those experiences of gratitude, leading to engagement in philanthropy and leading to the fundamental actions around fundraising that serve purpose, that best expressed in the human experiences, the stories that actually frame and talk to the lives lived of people, by people who've actually experienced something shaping and transformational in a healthcare context. I'm just going to ask Ross to join me to talk about a couple of experiences that have been experienced through Flinders to really bring that home to your experience here. Ross, over to you.
Thanks, Nigel. I think one of the most rewarding parts of our role is not only working with you, but being able to connect grateful patients and families to the work that you do and really start to make a difference and create some change. And there's a few examples of that in the room today, actually. Ali and Rachel are here and have received multiple myeloma scholarships as they're doing their PhDs through a Grateful Patients. Luke and Sam are here from the Prostate Cancer Research Team. That's off the back of a Grateful Patient that was actually here in 1988, believe it or not. And that his legacy will live on for quite some time now in support of prostate and bladder cancer research. We were expecting a couple of special guests today, but unfortunately the little one's not well. Andrew, I'm sorry. But they had a tragic experience in the neonatal unit, and I think the neonatal unit staff are here. Vanessa, hi. They didn't have a great experience in the neonatal unit, but they wanted to turn it into something positive because they were so grateful for the care they received. Subsequently, they've raised more than $100,000, which has gone back into the neonatal unit. So these examples, continue. And I guess that just demonstrates the role that we can play. We've got our gala dinner coming up in a couple of weeks' time. That's in its 33rd year, and that's off the back of a woman who had breast cancer who wanted to make a difference. And if you look at fundraising as one of the servants of philanthropy, Lynn Wrigley didn't contribute herself, but she certainly had a voice and certainly gave her time. And 33 years later, we've just received news that we've signed up the first Lynn Wrigley Fellow. So lots of good stories coming out of grateful patients and family members. I could go on and on and on, but I'll hand back to you, Nigel. But I think there's lots of opportunities there to continue working together.
Thanks, Ross. And what struck me as chatted with Ross and Lauren, sharing some of the stories around your experiences at Flinders, how resonant they were from the experiences I had working at Marta and other institutions. You touched on Lynn Wrigley. I remember the early stories around that. It reminds me of a young man named Adam Smitty. Adam died at 26 with melanoma, and one of his good mates, Mark Smoothie, was moved to ride from Brisbane to Townsville to do something that he and Adam had talked about, a credit card ride just with a backpack, and began a program called Smiling for Smitty, which still goes today. It's raised well over $10 million for cancers, not just melanoma. Along the journey, Adam's mum and dad were involved. Sadly, Maria passed away 5 years ago now with pancreatic cancer. So again, that coming home, sadly, is a family experience that Smitty's had. But this power of the movement that was created that continues to feed medical research is just beyond impressive. I think about neonatal critical care, and I think about Brett and Maria, who have 3 girls, youngest of which, Olivia, didn't make it past a couple of weeks in neonatal critical care. Chelsea and Maddie did, and are now well into their 20s and living great lives. But their response to the grief and to the almost inarticulable challenge that a family has in those experiences was to remember Olivia through a fundraising effort, which has continued to grow over well over a decade to raise well over $1 million as the family circumstances have changed. Brett and Maria have continued to become even more engaged in giving. And all of this is something that celebrates a life that wasn't lived, but a life that's never forgotten, a life that's actually about the gratitude that this family has to the staff that helped their girls that did come through neonatal critical care, and their one little girl who didn't. And I think, again, it talks to what gratitude is enabled. Now, again, the story of Mark Smoothie, remembering Adam Smitty, and the story of Brett Maria and Chelsea and Maddie were facilitated by folks in a foundation that actually recognise the desire to be thankful and exercise gratitude and put some wings under that expression and let that find its course. And I think about another man that I came to know over many years. His name is Ted. And Ted had no reason to be grateful to the hospital that I worked for, because he never had reason to attend there until his last few months of life. Ted lived to be 100, was a single man that lived a very frugal life, but through his life he carried something that was unrequited. He from his early age, he wanted to be in medicine but could never access that career path, but transitioned that aspiration into a love of a hospital that, as I said, he really had no reason to call on, because he was always healthy, right until he had a fall 2 months after his 100th birthday. Many years prior, Ted had indicated his desire to leave a gift in his will to, in this instance, the Martyr. And the thing that we could do as people in that organisation to be grateful for Ted's gift was to spend time to hear his story and just simply acknowledge that when he was gone, his aspirations, his intent would be carried forward. That was the best gift that we could give Ted. Ted's gift, when he did pass at 6 months after turning 100, was a gift that in dollar terms was close to $750,000. But in very practical terms, it was much, much more than that. It was an enduring legacy that continues to fund medical research. It's something that's an epitaph to a man that, leaving no family behind, has left a gift that actually continues to power an institution that he loved and a cause that was something particularly special to him for his own reasons. And I might say that Ted was a man who never gave significantly in his lifetime. The most significant gifts would be the occasional $50 note tucked in a pocket. But his gift was beyond measure in what it really offered. So I think thinking about the way in which we engage gratitude and enable gratitude, even from its most humble beginnings, begins again to reinforce this idea of how it fuels and serves philanthropy, and where philanthropy is enabled through the gifts that are given through fundraising, through time and voice and other mechanisms as well. So it leads us to this question of shift and how we shift things in the roles that we play and the contributions that we make. And just in closing, I want to touch on this. So for example, as I remarked on a moment ago, if we see the role of the team in the Flinders Foundation as being facilitators and enablers of relationships that in themselves facilitate the connections between gratitude and giving. We do sometimes fall into this place of seeming to chase money and chase checks. It's not the job of a foundation at all. It's much, much more than that. And to be liberated to actually facilitate relationships mean that in turn there's liberation to create the power of transformational giving. To be stewards and sustainers of relationships and the tangible outcomes that are generated through the gifts of time and voice and money. And to be managers and organisations of the functional processes that identify and connect and engage and sustain fundraising and philanthropy. But that work is never done in isolation and never something that can actually be effective without plugging into a broader environment, institutional environment. So this question of where this takes us in the context of clinical work and research work also is an important thing to think about when we think about how the shift might be maintained. It's where connections are forged and fueled. It's the work that means the most to people. It's the one that touches their lives in direct sense, in a clinical sense, and also the meaning that research offers as well. Not just for what is, but what is meant and what will come in the future as well. It's where relationships are formed and fostered, or critically sometimes deflected if those first line connections around gratitude aren't forged. And it's also a pathway to well-being in an increasingly complex and demanding environment. So here I'm not reflecting on the notion of gifts around philanthropy. I'm talking about the experience that's had in your environment in healthcare. There's a question and challenge for institutional leadership to understand and to frame philanthropy in a strategic context rather than seeing it as transactional and meeting short-term needs, which will always diminish and limit the power of possibility. To consider the influence and human aspiration over revenue and institutional needs. And here I'm issuing a really sharp and stark challenge to institutional leaders to see philanthropy and giving as much, much, much more than money. Much more powerful than that. And to enable and champion philanthropy and practices that sustain it. And again, it's been my experience that when you have institutional leadership that understands and empowers and articulates and advocates for philanthropy, things change in ways that could never otherwise be imagined. We think about donors are seen as people with aspirations and stories, not just a source of money. And this is an important shift we have to make in thinking about the way in which we engage with people who give. Are valued as long-term partners, not just seen as a cost. And I say that very overtly because some of the things that challenge good fundraising practice, challenge the engagement of philanthropy and get in the way of gratitude is when we see things as a cost rather than an opportunity. And that's a stark challenge again to leadership, particularly in and around the area of philanthropy. And part of a bigger picture, not just a sideline element. So the question here of donors playing a role centrally in an organisational premise, not being some adjunct or ancillary piece that occasionally adds to the organisational experience. To think about beneficiaries as people who are being served and are most likely to be those who also have the greatest reason to give, and how we've shaped that experience as someone who experiences care as being someone who may actually give in response to that as well, and how well do we do that. And to think about the community and the way in which we as healthcare institutions see community through the lens of community relevance, not through the importance that we might see from within an institutional context. What do we mean of and for the community that's being served are important questions to ask again. So what does this all mean in terms of where we take it? It's a shared understanding around the power of gratitude and how that transforms the human experience. A shared understanding of what we mean by philanthropy is simply exercising the love of people, and a way in which we think about those elements that serve it and serve philanthropy, giving time and giving voice and advocacy and giving money through fundraising actually play a role in serving purpose. thinking about all these things in a connected and systemic approach rather than being quite unconnected. And again, it's been my observation of institutions, not just within healthcare, that often these elements can be quite disparate and be quite unrelated. And to centralise this thinking as fundamentally all of our responsibilities. And I think that it's true to say that the engagement around philanthropy and the engagement in which informs and frames people's giving, born of gratitude, will so often start at the experience in a healthcare experience or be reinforced in conversations that are had in and around research and other factors which fuel and inform healthcare rather than moving straight to a fundraising conversation, because that won't make sense in and of itself. The question of trust, mutual trust. What do we trust each other as professional colleagues in a shared remit to do with and for each other? How we understand what we do and how we trust that process is critical as well, and how we frame, absorb and take on the different perspectives we bring to the experiences we have and respect those perspectives and see them as part of a greater whole. And all of that leads to enhanced opportunity. And once again, I return to this question of what we create as a lived experience in simply pursuing that which is obvious, that which is immediate, that which is short-term and transactional versus what we might imagine to be. So if we begin to open up the power of possibility through focusing on purpose and thinking about how gratitude frames and informs of our human experience, how we connect with each other, again under this context of philanthropy, and what this means for what is given and what is enabled. So all of this brings us back to the fundamental question of purpose. What purpose do we exist to serve in the work that we do? And how do we think about the role that people might play in serving that purpose? And fundamentally, that takes us back to this question and proposition that what and how we leverage the power of gratitude, and what simple shifts and understandings that we take on in framing the everyday things that we do differently, sometimes ever so slightly, that shift the experience that we shape, the experience that we respond to move people down a different path as they serve the purpose that's important to us all. Thank you.
I got a message halfway through to say that we can stay until 3:20. We thought we were in a rush to get out before 3, so we can take some questions. Has anyone got a question for Nigel, or is there any on the app that I don't have in front of me? Someone can shut them out. Is there any questions in the audience? Yes. Are you out here?
Somewhere?
Thank you. More a comment than anything, and I just like to thank you for that great talk. It really resonated with me on a couple of levels. I think the first one being my father actually spent some time in a ICU, well, 3 months in ICU after a really significant stroke, and he received fantastic care. And the nurses would, nurses, support staff, physios, speech therapists, everything were coming in, and we kept asking them, what can we give to you to say, thank you? And they sort of kept shutting us down and sort of saying, oh, you can't do anything for us. We just want your dad to get better and things like that. And in a way, I think it just really resonated. It kind of took away what we wanted to do. We really wanted to do something for them. And in the end, we just put some money into their Christmas party and, anonymously. And we just said, hope you have a really great time and things like that. But then my dad actually ended up he had quite a miraculous recovery and ended up raising a bunch of money, about $20,000, to buy a piece of specialist equipment for the hospital that can then go benefit people like him in the future. And it was a really powerful thing for him to be able to give back and say thank you. It was important for his recovery. It was important for his future well-being and things like that. So I just, thanks a lot. It was really, really insightful.
I couldn't tell a better story than that. Thanks for sharing that. Sorry, I missed your name before. Luke, thank you. And I guess it's been my observation repeatedly over time that we risk deflecting that human experience, the human response, with every sometimes good reason of attending to the job that we see at hand. And in and of itself, it's not wrong, but I think the limitation of possibility. I mean, you persevered as a family, and your father particularly, and had the opportunity to do so with a good outcome. But not everyone does that. In fact, I'd say that's far less common than it is more. So the question I'm really posing is the what if question. What if we actually just stepped back and looked at this differently? And what if we challenged some of those assumptions and experiences that might otherwise limit us to just doing what we think is reasonably our job to do, and open up that question of what else might be so. And I think it is easy, particularly in an environment such as this, where we can readily, with reason, dismiss the intangible, the unproven, the elements that don't have evidence behind them, to be less important, perhaps, than they otherwise might be, and trust in that experience that we all share as people, and the process we all move through. So Luke, I think again I can only say thank you for sharing what has been a wonderful way to highlight what we've been talking about this afternoon. Are there other questions? Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. That's the first time I've met Luke. Luke is the recipient of the Ralph Ernst Fellowship, the gentleman who was cared for here in 1988. So congratulations on the fellowship too, Luke, and thanks for sharing your story. I think at Flinders Foundation, storytelling is at the centre of everything that we do, and meeting you and families like you and sharing those stories, it compels other people to want to support those causes as well. We certainly don't expect clinicians to try and solicit donations directly. We see that as our role in working with you. It might be that you refer those people to us, but getting comfortable accepting the gratitude and letting them know that the foundation's there should they want to consider that, is something that I'd ask you to take away today as well.
I can just add, one of the questions that I've come across in particularly healthcare context is this sense of protection of people in particularly the experience of care. That is to say that sometimes we might take on from a clinical perspective, particularly a sense or a duty of care that we need to protect patients and their families from exposure or intrusions even that might compromise or threaten their experience and well-being. I think that's very apt and reasonable, but at the same time to counterbalance that with the question of, well, what happens if we don't enable that, and how do those experiences that Luke just talked of not become fulfilled if we inadvertently, with every bit of good intent, get in the way. And I think the thing that really potentially shifts this is that sense of trust between colleagues, that the questions of vulnerability, the questions of how people are actually treated and managed, are actually pursued in an appropriate and authentic, and particularly in a respectful and dignified fashion, that there aren't points of inappropriate engagement or intervention that actually compromise the nature of relationship. So I think when I talk about the sense of mutual trust, this is really, really important in colleagues across a large institution trusting each other that they will do their respective work in a way that is compatible and commensurate with the expectations that are held. And I think that the counterpoint again is also to give folks who want to give back the pathway, if you will, to determining their own opportunities in terms of how they actually make the decisions that you and your family talked of, Luke, as well.
Is there any other questions in the audience or on the app? No? There is? Okay.
So look, thank you very much, Nigel. It was a great talk, actually. My name's Andrew Burst. I'm the Director of Research here, but I was the Director of the Intensive Care Unit here for a long time. Sorry there. So, look, thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. My name's Andrew Burst. I'm the Director of Research here, so who got a bit of a finger in it all. But I was the Director of the Intensive Care Unit for a long time. As well, I still do a little bit of work there. And I just want to draw you out maybe on a couple of things there, because in those sort of roles, we're often exposed to really, I guess very, very awkward, difficult situations with families. And I think, but how do we get equity across the health system sometimes, I guess, is my question. And I think that's maybe a question for you too, Ross, and that's some, as you know, that's one of the things we've been trying to do here, because it is very difficult. People have often said we'd like to get something that would be beneficial, and there's one view over here that our system should be able to provide these things for everybody, but we know that that's not quite what we have available to us. But also, and sometimes, we've always wanted to do the best we could and be at the absolute top of the tree for the ICU and the neonatal and all those sorts of things. I think everybody does in their own areas, but of course you have different exposures and different opportunities. So how do we make some of that equitable and help our clinicians understand how to work with people like the foundation?
I'm happy to start if you like. I think that, again, it does come back a lot to the soft skills, for better or for worse, and as challenging as that may be. The notions of balance and equity, and even the sort of process to help all are difficult to prosecute in the context of how and where human relationships take us. So I think really what I'm focusing on this conversation, and indeed with others, is let's attend to the simple things in front of us, the relationships that actually exist in those experiences, and often the very difficult experiences as well. They'll be the ones that sometimes, and you experience this far more than I, that forge the bonds that become very real and often unbreakable in the sense of how people connect with each other. But I think that opening people up to the opportunity of what can be accomplished through giving as well, and again, I return to this idea that whilst we might be naturally disposed to giving, we don't easily find our way into what we give and how we give and where that might be beneficial. So I think, once again, recognising those opening opportunities, if you will, of the beginnings of relationships, and then how that might be taken to next and subsequent steps beyond that become important. That's where the work that you would do and have done in both an intensive care context and even in research connects very much with the work of Ross and his team in terms of how that relationship might be progressed. Of course, as I touched on, it means that you need to trust that the relationship that you would steward and tackle in a particular way will be managed in a appropriate and commensurate fashion as it's handed on to others as well, and that's terribly important. The challenge with the equity question is human experience will always lead to some level of inequity and imbalance, so we can't really reconcile that easily. But I think opening up the question of possibility is the starting point. Ross?
It's a challenge for the foundation, Andrew, at the equity issue. Salin is a huge beast, and our role is to support Salin, but also Flinders University across 4 colleges. So the equity question becomes even more complex. I think it starts with, especially with Salin, in building a culture of philanthropy. We spoke this morning about, at MARTA, Nigel established an alumni program for nurses and midwives. And that went from people keen to support a niche area to supporting MARTA for the greater good, and I think you said they started bleeding MARTA. They were that. And, how do we start to build that culture of philanthropy at Salin where everyone wants to contribute for the greater good? Not just for their specific area of interest. And I think that would then help sort the equity issue. Now, that's not going to be easy, and it's going to take quite some time. But through building relationships and all working towards a shared purpose will help get us there. So it's probably a politician's way of answering that question. But
I think if I just add to that, Ross, you never ultimately resolve the question of equity. There will always be imbalance and different pathways that people take. But if you increase the scale at which people engage and give, and particularly over time, then I think that begins to address more possibility and more opportunity. I think that's where the shift can be made to its greatest extent. I don't believe, well, actually, no, there is some evidence here that I think continues to reinforce this. I don't believe we've begun to leverage the power of philanthropy in this country. And then, oddly enough, we've actually moved further away from that experience, which was particularly rife in the post-war period and 60s and 70s and certainly prior to that. Today, I just noticed actually since our conversation this morning that the Australian Centre for Philanthropy and Non-Profit Studies have released their giving data for 2020. I haven't had a chance to have a look at it yet, but I'm going to suggest that it says a couple of things. Firstly, that giving grew in 2020, which we saw with bushfires and we saw with pandemic responses, but we're also seeing giving continuing to concentrate in fewer people giving more. So there's opportunity there, but I think there's far more to be realised because those larger gifts come off the back of focus on purpose, trust, longer term relationships and a genuine investment in continuity and confidence over time as well. So we've got a lot of work to do to lift the bar, but I think that rising tide is the question that might get us closer, never addressing completely, but much more expansive view on what people might give.
As I mentioned earlier, Nigel's on the board of the Institute for Sustainable Philanthropy in the UK, and they do put a scientific lens over philanthropy. So they've just released a report. You might want to talk a little bit about that, and that there's some scientific evidence behind a relationship-based approach to fundraising, which is what we're trying to achieve at Flinders.
Yeah, look, it's something that's exciting, not just because I'm a director of the Institute for Sustainable Philanthropy, but more so because it's been one of the nods that I've seen lacking in evidence in fundraising practice for decades now. But I've watched over the last 4 or 5 years this question being put to what if we engage donors in a different type of conversation that attended to their interests and their aspirations and focused on them, not in a sycophantic or indulgent way, but simply in communicating to people in ways that they respond to. So this work has been tested in a number of different contexts now with different organisations in different spheres. And what I think is most exciting in every context has actually resulted in giving more than doubling. Now that's powerful. We invest in relationships and giving increases. What we've done typically is not spend money on investing relationships. We've spent as least little money as we can on just investing in transactions. So there's a significant shift which I think addresses this question of also the polarisation or the focusing on the growing of giving in a concentrated band, because we've been perhaps just making and creating a lot of market noise, but also some interesting research that's coming out at the moment, which is talking about the idea that organisations that invest in their functional processes and capacity to engage actually end up serving purpose to a much greater extent as well. So I think there's some triangulation here, but I think the exciting part about that is if we actually engage people in a way that they look to be engaged, giving grows. How wonderful.
All right. Well, we might close it there unless there's any more questions, but I'd just like to thank you, Nigel, for your time. Welcome back to Adelaide. The only downside is that he goes for Port Power. Other than that, we're always happy to see you, Nigel, and welcome back anytime.
Thanks, Ross. Thanks everyone for having me, and again, thanks for the opportunity for having this conversation.